The rain had stopped just before dawn. Inside a half-collapsed hangar outside Gotha, Germany, the air smelled of ash, oil, and defeat. American engineers from the 9th Air Force moved through the wreckage with flashlights, expecting to find another pile of broken Messerschmitts. But when one of them pulled back a dusty tarp, the beam of light caught something that made the whole group freeze. Beneath it lay a machine that looked nothing like the war they knew. A black-winged shape, smooth and seamless, stretched across the concrete floor like the skeleton of a creature not yet born. No tail, no fuselage, just a single curve of wood and metal that seemed to grow from its own shadow. Captain James Bell, an aeronautical engineer from Ohio, knelt beside it. "Jesus," he whispered. "This thing shouldn't fly." He ran his hand over the surface, not cold steel, but something stranger. The texture was faintly rough, almost organic, like burnt bark. Another engineer tapped the edge with a wrench and frowned. "That's not aluminum," he said. "It's wood." Bell looked closer. The outer skin was plywood, but not ordinary plywood, thin layers soaked in resin, mixed with black dust that rubbed off like coal. He sniffed it. "Charcoal," he murmured. They mixed it into the glue. Someone laughed nervously. "What for, camouflage?" "No," Bell said, standing. "This stuff eats radar." For a moment, the hangar went silent except for the dripping rain. Then another soldier called out from the far end, holding up a small metal plate. On it were stenciled letters, HO 9V3. Below, in faded pencil, Raymar and Walter Horton, Project 229. The men exchanged looks. None of them recognized the name. They began documenting everything: sketches, photos, serial numbers. In one corner, half buried under debris, lay 2 jet engines, the same junkers Jumo 004s used in the Me-262. But here, the intakes were buried inside the wing itself, hidden from the air. "Twin turbojets," Bell muttered, tracing the shape of the ducts. "If they'd finished this thing." He didn't finish the thought. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, revealing a small airfield scorched black by retreating German forces. Burned blueprints littered the ground. One was still legible, a sketch of the same winged shape, annotated in neat German handwriting. At the top, a title, Nerflugel, Flying Wing. Bell folded it carefully into his pocket. "Get this back to right field," he said. "Every page. Every piece." As they prepared to transport the wreck, one of the enlisted men wandered to the far wall and found something odd, a painted phrase, half scorched by fire. "When SIEUNS nicht sehen, können SIEUNS nicht töten." If they can't see us, they can't kill us. That night, in their makeshift quarters, Bell couldn't sleep. He spread the photographs across his cot, that dark, impossible aircraft with its curved silhouette and strange, predatory grace. It didn't look like it belonged to 1945. It looked like something from another century, or another kind of mind altogether. He tried to imagine it in the air, moving faster than sound, invisible to radar, silent until too late. He thought about the cities it might have reached, London, perhaps even New York, if the war had lasted another year. The idea chilled him more than the cold. In the morning, a report was sent to Allied Command. Recovered experimental jet aircraft, presumed Horton HO 229. Condition partial. Construction material, composite wood/resin. Possible low radar reflective design. The officers who read it dismissed the last line as exaggeration. Radar absorbing plywood? Impossible. The file was stamped technical curiosity and shelved under miscellaneous German projects. But Bell kept one photograph for himself, the view from the hangar door, showing the Horton's black wing glinting faintly under sunlight. He would later say it haunted him, because it looked alive, not like a plane, but like something waiting for the world to catch up. Years later, in an interview, he recalled that first moment under the tarp. "It wasn't like discovering a weapon," he said quietly. "It was like discovering the future, and realizing it had been built by the enemy." He paused, remembering the burnt words on the wall. If they can't see us, they can't kill us. He wondered if the Horton brothers had truly meant to hide, or if they had simply built the one thing mankind would always fear most, a shadow that could fly. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Before they were engineers, they were glider kids, flying on wind and faith. Germany, early 1930s. The country was broke, humiliated, hungry for speed. On the hills above Bonn, two thin teenagers carried a home-built glider made of spruce, linen, and nerve. Raymar, the younger, had a mechanic's hands and a sketchbook full of wings that looked like leaves. Walter, older by 2 years, had a pilot's calm and the reflex to lean into risk. Their father, a World War I officer who still polished his medals on Sundays, watched them run along the ridge and shouted the only command that mattered: feel the air. They did. The first time they lifted free, it was barely a second, a hop and a thump, but to them it was liturgy. Raymar wrote in a school notebook that same night, in tight graphite, "We want wings that are alive. We want the airplane to be only wing, and the pilot to be only intention." The boys read everything they could find: Lilienthal's fatal curves, Prandtl's boundary layers, whispers of a flying wing, a pure lifting surface, no wasteful tail, no draggy fuselage, just a single idea held against gravity. Germany's new rulers understood pageantry better than physics. But in the gaps of a regime still consolidating power, there was room for dreamers with tools. A national gliding movement, encouraged by the ban on powered flight, became a laboratory hidden in plain sight. At Wasserkup in 1933, the brothers Hoey hopped cleanly off the slope, then sailed farther than anyone expected. Judges noted unusual stability without tail. Skeptics muttered, "Suicide." The crowd just clapped because the shape looked like it wanted to keep going. They had no factory, just a cold shed, a hand saw, and a mother who boiled glue on the stove until the kitchen smelled like ambition. They stretched linen with dope until it sang under a fingertip. They balanced wing sections on nails to find the center of gravity by feel. Raymar fussed over reflex airfoils and drag rudders at the wingtips. Walter learned to land a machine that had no tail to forgive him. Crashes were data. A cracked spar meant the next spar would be smarter. In 1937 the Ho-3, still unpowered, still stubbornly all-wing, won a Luftwaffe-sponsored competition. The prize was a handshake from officers who wore polished boots and carried clipboards like verdicts. Hermann Göring himself glanced at the photographs and said the sentence that sealed their trajectory: "Give these dreamers engines, and see what happens." In that moment, the brothers' private vow collided with a state that wanted range to London and back, wanted altitude, velocity, and a photograph of victory to hang in a marble hallway. The courtship began. Uniforms toured the shed. Funding arrived with strings disguised as opportunities. The Horton signature, a wing like a gull's laugh, was pulled into official programs under names with numbers: Nerflugel Project, later Ho-9. The romance of air met the bureaucracy of war. Every drawing acquired stamps. Every test acquired an audience. They tried power gently at first, a pusher prop on a small prototype, and learned what torque could do to a plan with too few references. Then the world accelerated. The Messerschmitt Me 262 whispered a new grammar: jet thrust. The brothers traced lines around twin turbojets, not under a fuselage, there was none, but buried in the thickness of the wing, bending intake ducts like rivers around obstacles. Raymar worried about yaw without a fin. He invented split drag rudders at the tips. Walter took a test article up and came down white-faced and laughing, the particular laugh of a man who has been someplace he doesn't yet have words for. There were compromises. Wood, not aluminum, because metal was rationed, because wood hid in plain sight, because plywood could be bent to curves a sheet mill would mock. Resin instead of rivets, because smooth mattered, because radar had become a new kind of searchlight and the wing deserved a cloak. In a margin, Raymar wrote, almost offhand, pulver coal in the glue. Powdered carbon in the binder to turn the skin dark to radio waves. Not stealth. Just survival disguised as chemistry. The Luftwaffe demanded paperwork at the speed of panic. We require a fighter with 1,000 kilometers range and 1,000 kilometers per hour speed, one memorandum read, as if velocity were a commodity you could requisition. The brothers nodded, returned to their shed, and solved problems one splinter at a time. They lived on coffee, black bread, and momentum. When a jig warped in damp air, they slept on the floor beside it to keep the room warm. They were not blind to the flag on the wall. They kept their politics as thin as the plywood they bent, believing, perhaps foolishly, perhaps bravely, that a pure wing belonged to sky, not to uniforms. In later letters, Raymar would say, "We were not making a weapon. We were making a solution." The war made it a weapon. By 1938 they had a glide ratio that embarrassed conventional trainers. By 1941 they had an unpowered wing that could stay aloft for hours, whispering along ridge lift like a secret. Engineers from major firms came to stare and leave with questions they didn't want to ask aloud. A young aerodynamicist from Göttingen ran his palm along the leading edge and murmured, "It is wrong, in the correct way." Then the regime asked for the thing all regimes ask, proof. A demonstration in front of brass, a schedule no weather could honor, a delivery date that ignored physics. Walter agreed to fly the prototype in gusty crosswind and brought it back whole with a scrape along one wingtip and a sentence he intended as warning, not heroism, "She will not forgive mistakes." The colonel clapped. The date moved closer. Gotha Wagon Fabric took the contract. Railway car builders learned to cut wings. The shed became a line. The sketches became parts with serial numbers. The brothers were issued passes, badges, an office where the window didn't open. Every day, the war grew louder, sirens, shortages, letters edged in black, and every day the wing grew smoother under their hands. When the power went out, they sanded by candlelight. When resin ran short, they thinned it with a solvent that stung their eyes and hope. On a gray morning in 1944, a colonel from Berlin visited the shop floor. He touched the plywood skin with 2 fingers and frowned as if touching a rumor. "This is a fighter?" he asked. Raymar met his gaze and said the only answer he had, "It is a wing." The colonel looked unconvinced, then looked captivated despite himself, the way men sometimes are when they meet a future that does not require their permission. The brothers were nearly ready. Engines waited on crates. Control linkages clicked with mechanical truth. A nosewheel sat at an angle that made the whole machine look like a predator about to pounce. They rolled the black wing into the light, and even the riveters went quiet. They had started as 2 boys lifting a glider into a bon wind with their father's hand steadying the tail. Now they stood in a factory under orders stamped with eagles, about to show a country on fire that air could still be taught a new trick. And the machine that had no tail, no fuselage, and almost no precedent was ready to meet the one opponent the regime could not brief against, the radar beam. In the winter of 1944, Germany's skies belonged to the Allies. Every dawn, the sound of bombers rolled over ruined cities like thunder that never stopped. Yet deep in the Thuringian forest, inside a hidden hangar near Gotha, 2 brothers were building something the bombers might never see. The air smelled of resin and damp wood. Raymar Horton stood over the half-finished frame of the Ho 229 V2, tracing the curve of its wing with a gloved hand. There was no fuselage, no tail, just a single, seamless body. "It must breathe," he said softly. "Not fight the air, flow with it." His assistant nodded, though no one really understood how such a shape could stay stable. They worked in silence, interrupted only by air raids that shook the walls. Every sound from above reminded them that time was running out. The Reich was collapsing. Fuel was scarce, aluminum rarer still. But plywood, they had plywood. Sheets of beech and birch, pressed together with resin mixed with a fine black dust. It left stains on their hands, impossible to wash away. When a Luftwaffe inspector asked why the wings were dark, Raymar simply replied, "For strength." What he didn't mention was the experiment, powdered coal, carbonized and bound in glue. It absorbed radar waves in a way that no one had measured, but he could feel it in instinct. The surface didn't reflect, it swallowed light. We didn't call it stealth, he would later say. We called it survival. In February, the second prototype was ready. Twin Jumo 004B turbojets nestled inside the wings, the intakes buried deep to hide the heat signature. The nose was smooth, the canopy curved like a droplet of mercury. On the day of its first flight, the airfield was frozen, the runway dusted with snow. Test pilot Erwin Ziller, young and fearless, climbed into the cockpit and gave a casual salute. "Let's see if your flying shadow has a soul," he joked. The turbines screamed to life. Black smoke poured from the intakes as the strange, wing-shaped machine began to move, slowly at first, then faster, until it lifted cleanly off the ground. It didn't roar like other jets, it whispered, slicing through the cold air like a blade through silk. For a few minutes, everyone on the ground forgot the war. The Ho-229 banked, graceful and silent, a shape that seemed to belong to another age. Ziller's voice came through the radio, calm but tinged with disbelief. "It feels alive," he said. "Like flying a thought." Then, 10 minutes later, something went wrong. One engine sputtered, coughed black smoke, and flamed out. The aircraft wobbled, lost lift, and dropped too fast for recovery. It hit the ground in a shower of debris and fire. Ziller didn't survive. The wreck was pulled from the mud the next day, the elegant black wing reduced to ash and splinters. The Luftwaffe called it an unfortunate accident. Raymar called it proof. They had measured the radar cross-section of the remaining prototype. Compared to a Me-262, it was almost invisible, less than one-tenth the reflection. The results were noted in a short technical memo and filed away among hundreds of desperate projects. By spring, the Allies were closing in. The brothers were ordered to move their work to an underground facility. Trains carried the unfinished Ho-229 V3 to Gotha wagon fabric, where American bombs fell just days later. Still, the black wing survived, hidden beneath the concrete, awaiting discovery. When the Americans finally arrived in April 1945, they found it covered in tarps and dust, its surface cool and strange under their hands. They didn't yet understand what they were looking at. The papers, blueprints, and fragments would be packed into crates marked Foreign Technology Division. The Horton brothers were separated before the war ended. Walter, the pilot, was captured by the British. Raymar disappeared into the ruins, taking with him sketches and a single wooden model small enough to fit in a suitcase. Decades later, in an interview in Argentina, Raymar would smile faintly when asked if his design had truly been invisible to radar. "Invisible," he said. "No. Just unseen. There's a difference." He paused, remembering the moment that winter when his brother's creation first lifted into the air, a dark, impossible shape rising against a gray sky, as if the future had briefly mistaken the century it belonged to. And for those 10 minutes before it fell, the world's first stealth aircraft had already flown. Summer 1945. The war was over, but the hunger to understand it wasn't. Inside a drafty hangar at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, England, a team of American and British engineers stood around what looked less like a plane and more like a relic from another civilization. The captured Horton Ho-229 lay disassembled across workbenches, its black, wing-shaped body now a puzzle of wood, resin, and twisted metal. Operation Seahorse had one task: dissect the impossible. Colonel John Sanderson, a veteran aeronautical engineer with the U.S. Army Air Forces, flipped open his leather notebook. His first line read simply, "It's light. Too light. Like it's not supposed to be seen." The technicians began peeling back the wooden skin layer by layer. The smell of burnt resin mixed with the sharp scent of graphite dust. Every panel they lifted revealed something that shouldn't have existed in 1945, precision engineering that defied the chaos of a collapsing empire. "This isn't desperation," Sanderson muttered. "This is foresight." The surface wasn't ordinary plywood. Each sheet was bonded with a resin laced with fine, metallic gray powder. Under a magnifying glass, the mixture shimmered faintly, like black sand under moonlight. Graphite, said one of the British scientists. It's conductive. Absorbs radio waves. Sanderson frowned. You're telling me this plane eats radar? There was silence. No one laughed. They ran an impromptu test. A low-power radar emitter in the hangar was aimed at a section of the wing. The signal came back muted, far weaker than expected. It wasn't a trick. The material actually drank the reflection. He didn't just build a plane, said one of the engineers. He built a question mark for radar. Word spread quietly through the lab. Some dismissed it as coincidence, an accident of materials, nothing more. Others, like Sanderson, saw something deeper, a deliberate attempt to disappear from the enemy's sight. He wrote again in his journal, "This is not camouflage. This is philosophy." They continued to disassemble the craft, documenting every rib and spar. Inside the wing, control rods were placed at unconventional angles to maintain stability without a vertical tail. Every inch of its geometry served the same purpose, to minimize drag, turbulence, and visibility. It was, in every sense, a machine built to slip through the air unseen and untouched. One British engineer, pacing the hangar floor, stopped suddenly at the sight of the engine mounts. "Do you realize," he said, "this configuration could reach London in 20 minutes from France?" The room went quiet. He pointed to the aerodynamic profile on the chalkboard. With twin Jumo 004B turbojets embedded in the wings, and an estimated top speed near 1,000 km per hour, the math was terrifyingly simple. From a hidden runway in occupied territory, the Ho 229 could cross the channel faster than any warning radar could detect or intercept. Sanderson drew a straight line from Calais to London and tapped the map. 20 minutes, he echoed. And no one would see it coming. The silence turned heavy. Even in peacetime, the implications were chilling. If the Germans had built 10 of these, or 100. They examined the cockpit next. Sparse, utilitarian, but strangely elegant. The canopy curved seamlessly into the wing, giving the pilot a panoramic view, and almost no radar signature. Sanderson ran a finger along the molded frame, muttering, "This isn't a prototype. It's a prophecy." In the corner of the hangar, under a pile of scorched documents, an assistant found a fragment of German notes, half-burned but legible. Zeal, unsichtbar für Funkmessgerät. Objective, invisible to radar. That night, Sanderson stayed late after the others had gone. The hangar was dim, lit by one swinging bulb. He placed his hand flat on the cold wing and felt its smoothness, neither wood nor metal, but something in between. Something ahead of its time. He imagined it in the air, a black shadow racing through clouds, undetectable, uncatchable. It was beautiful in a way that frightened him. Because beauty, he realized, was what had made it possible. Two dreamers, somewhere in a ruined country, had chased perfection, and stumbled into the future of warfare. When he filed his report, the final paragraph read: "The Horton 229 represents a concept unknown to our design philosophy. It is not just fast. It is invisible in ways we do not yet understand." Above that note, he scrawled one more sentence, the one the archivists underlined years later. This aircraft could have changed the outcome, had it arrived a season sooner. Outside, the summer rain began to fall, tapping gently against the hangar roof. The dissection was over, but the unease it left behind lingered, a quiet understanding that the war's strangest machine had not been born of desperation, but of vision. And when they turned off the lights that night, the black wing seemed to fade into the shadows, as if even in death, it refused to be seen. In early 1946, the crates marked captured enemy technology. Ho 229 arrived at Wright Field, Ohio. The war trophies were still coated in the gray dust of Germany, warped panels, burned resin, and pieces of a dream that looked more like myth than metal. But the Americans weren't finished with it yet. In Hangar 23, technicians began reassembling the wreck. They laid the wings out on the floor like pieces of a puzzle, tracing each curve against blueprints copied from German notes. The smell of oil and lacquer filled the air. "You sure this thing flew?" one of them asked, squinting at the wing's bizarre sweep. "That's what they say," another replied. And apparently, it scared the hell out of the British. The reconstruction took months. Metal brackets replaced broken ones, the engines were substituted with dummies for safety. When finished, the aircraft stretched 36 feet across, smooth, seamless, alien. Someone compared it to a manta ray. Someone else whispered, "Looks like it fell from the future." Once complete, it was time for the real test, not of flight, but of invisibility. The Ho-229 was mounted on a wooden frame inside a radar testing chamber. Across the room, an SCR-584 radar dish hummed to life, its beams sweeping the dark space. The engineers waited for the bright pulse that should have bounced back from the aircraft's broad wings. But the scope stayed mostly quiet. "Run it again," Sanderson ordered. The operator turned the dials, recalibrated, fired another pulse. Still, the screen showed almost nothing, just a faint blur, like static. "We thought the equipment was broken," one technician later recalled. But it wasn't. The carbon-impregnated plywood, the curved geometry, even the absence of vertical stabilizers, together they formed a near-invisible echo. The Ho-229 didn't reflect the radar beam. It absorbed it, scattered it, hid in plain sight. Sanderson leaned closer to the display, murmuring, "Gentlemen, this is not an accident." They measured the effective radar cross-section, barely a fraction of any jet-sized object. Even stripped of its engines, the machine confused the most advanced Allied radar of the war. "If they'd had 6 more months," one of the scientists whispered, "our bombers would never have come home." The numbers didn't lie. The Hortons had discovered, without knowing the word, the first principles of stealth. Their obsession with aerodynamics, their insistence on smoothness, their experiments with conductive materials had built a fighter decades ahead of its time. Still, disbelief lingered. Some insisted the results came from errors in calibration. Others warned it was pointless, the war was over, and this belonged to history. But not everyone was ready to let it die. The U.S. Air Technical Intelligence Command quietly filed a report under Project Lusty. The Horton design demonstrates significant reduction in radar visibility. Further study warranted. Behind closed doors, engineers began sketching new possibilities, flying wings without tails, bodies shaped like ghosts. A young Northrop designer, visiting from California, studied the captured plane and muttered, "So this is what freedom looks like to air itself." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A machine born under a swastika had just revealed a future that would redefine American defense. The idea that the enemy's genius might live on, unacknowledged, unnamed, unsettled the men who studied it. Sanderson, who had once dismantled the Black Wing in Farnborough, wrote his final note before the project was classified. "It's not the material that haunts me, it's the mind behind it. He didn't think like us. He thought like the air." He closed the file, and the hangar went dark. Outside, in the wind that swept across the Ohio airfield, a low hum echoed between buildings, a sound almost like a distant jet, almost like memory. The Americans had proven what the Germans could only imagine. And yet, what truly frightened them wasn't what the aircraft had done, but what it meant. Because to outsmart the sky, you had to think like a ghost. The war had ended, but its shadows refused to fade. By the late 1940s, in quiet hangars across California and Ohio, engineers were sketching something they could not quite name. On the blueprints, its shape looked like a ghost of the past, the Horton wing, reborn in American ink. At first, no one admitted the connection. The Horton Ho-229 was officially just another curiosity, a captured relic of the Reich. But inside Wright Field, in rooms labeled restricted access, experimental aerodynamics, the old German contours began to reappear. The idea refused to die. Northrop engineers pored over the measurements, running their fingers along the same curves once drawn in the forests of Thuringia. "No tail, no drag," one whispered. "It's not a plane. It's a philosophy." The shape that once terrified London now promised to protect Washington. In 1948, the first American descendant took to the air, the Northrop YB-49 flying wing. It rose silently from the desert floor, its two jet engines roaring like distant thunder. From the ground, it didn't look like it was flying, it looked like it was sliding through the sky. Pilots called it the shadow bird. Reporters called it madness. But for the engineers watching from the runway, it was something else, vindication. In the official report, one line stood out. YB-49 demonstrates unusual radar behavior, return weaker than expected. No one used the word stealth yet, but everyone felt it forming. The flying wing was unstable, prone to sudden stalls. 2 test pilots died when one broke apart over the Mojave. The project was quietly cancelled, officially for safety reasons, though many suspected something else. The Air Force wasn't ready for an aircraft too far ahead of its own thinking. The black wing went back into storage, buried beneath bureaucracy. But the idea lingered, quiet, patient, evolving. Through the 1950s and 60s, whispers of low observable design circulated among classified projects. Radar scientists remembered the Horton wing that had confused every instrument in 1946. Aerodynamicists sketched cleaner, smoother forms, chasing the same dream. Every few years, another prototype would appear, echoing the ghostly shape of that wartime machine. Then came 1981. A new aircraft rolled out under the highest secrecy at Groom Lake, Nevada. It was called Senior Ice, what the world would later know as the B-2 Spirit. Its creators at Northrop never mentioned the Hortons publicly, but among engineers, there was no doubt. The lineage was unmistakable. The same silhouette. The same silence in the sky. A retired scientist, decades later, said in an interview. If you trace the DNA of the B-2, it leads straight back to that wooden wing the Germans built in a barn. It's the same bloodline, just refined, perfected, hidden behind better intentions. Raymar Horton, living quietly in Argentina, saw a photograph of the new bomber in a newspaper. His hair was white by then, his hands frail, but his eyes lit up. They learned, he said simply. We wanted to make war machines disappear. Maybe one day they'll make wars disappear, too. He died in 1994, the same year the B-2 flew over Washington for the first time. Today, inside the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center, the surviving Horton Ho-229 rests under soft museum light. Visitors walk past without realizing they're looking at the blueprint of the future. Its wings still gleam faintly black, its frame scarred but intact. On the information plaque, one sentence reads. Captured by U.S. Forces, 1945. Believed to be the world's first stealth aircraft. Every night, when the museum lights dim and the hangar falls silent, the black wing seems to vanish into the dark, as if its old secret still works. Outside, high above the Atlantic, a modern stealth bomber drifts unseen through the clouds, shaped by the same logic, the same dream. The war is long over, yet its echo still flies. History has a strange sense of humor. The first invisible aircraft was built by men the world swore to forget, men whose invention would outlive their ideology. The world remembers their crimes. The sky remembers their genius. And somewhere, between those two memories, the shadow of the Horton brothers still glides, invisible, eternal. Because some machines don't just survive history. They rewrite it.